Okay, we wanted to take a look at something that is called the average life potential scale. And this rather complicated drawing is actually very easy to understand. What we have on the vertical axis is the average potential of an individual to be healthy. So it goes from the 0 point all the way up to 100, and even beyond that to 100 plus. Now we also have negative potential, and that goes to minus 100%. On the horizontal axis, we're talking about time, and so we have age going out, in this instance, all the way to 140 years. Below that, we have generations, which are typically 20 years in duration. So what we have depicted here are 6 generations. But for the time being, we just want to pay attention to the individual. Now the green line at the top is an individual who is living an ideal existence that fulfills what the Honorable Elijah Muhammad talked about, is that there is no limit to the human life. So even out here at 140 years, this individual's life is going on pretty much at 100% potential, and maybe even a little bit above. That's ideal. That would be perfect health under ideal situations, where basically human lifespan is limitless and immortality is a reality. Now, we don't live in an ideal world, but the orange line also begins here at 100% potential at birth, and then over time the potential goes down, but not at a very rapid rate. And then somewhere here at around age 110, the person crosses the 0 line and actually dies somewhere a little shy of 130 years. Now that is a realistic possibility in today's world, with today's knowledge of nutrition and other factors. Now that might sound fantastic to some, because what are we used to? Well, let's take a look at this red line. And let's just say, for argument's sake, that this individual's life begins here at 100% potential, and then proceeds in what we consider to be a normal fashion, that with aging, the life potential falls. So that somewhere around here at age 30 or so, this individual is at around 50% of his born potential. And then by age 40 or so, this person has now crossed into the disability zone. What that means is now there are signs and symptoms of disease that become increasingly severe as time goes on. So this is a typical life curve of a person who then dies somewhere around the age of 70. Now, here's what we hope that we're doing here at Abundant Life Health Attainment Center. Let's look at the individual here in the blue. Starts out with 100% potential at the beginning of life, goes through a fairly typical downward slope until adulthood. This is around age 30. Now begins to notice some things not quite right in the body. Problems, issues. Perhaps they've visited a doctor or a clinic, or they've been in the hospital. Maybe they needed surgery. and they got pretty far down here to in the negative. What we're looking at is a minus 20, and that means that's a person who has some significant pathology taking place. But right here, there's an intervention. Perhaps they visited the Abundant Life Health Attainment Center, and then they start on an upward path over a period of time, so that at a certain point, they're out of the disability zone. There's no more further problems, and they continue to increase their life potential to be healthy, and over a period of time, they actually attain to a high level of health, and they also continue to live indefinitely. Now that would be what we would call an ideal rescue. This is what we're after when we say health attainment at Abundant Life Clinic. This is what we're after, to find somebody at an advanced stage, not too advanced, but at an advanced stage of illness, and rescue them and bring them to an ideal state. Now, let's turn our attention to two arrows here. One's pointing up and one's pointing down. And the one that is pointing down is representing all of those forces that are acting on the potential of an individual to depress it, to make it less. So that is called anti-survival. The arrow that is pointing up are those factors, those interventions that tend to improve survival potential of an individual. And so those are the positive things that we want to engender in order to bring about the kind of ideal rescue scene that we just looked at. Now finally, we want to look at generations. This is based in theory on the studies done by Dr. Francis Pottinger in the late 30s and 40s, where he studied what happens to nutritionally deficient cats. He studied over 900 cats, and basically what he found was that malnutrition, poor nutrition, can be inherited. This flies in the face of what we consider to be modern genetic theory, but in fact he proved it. So you start out with a generation that is 100%, let's say. But if they are actually fed a nutritionally deficient diet, then the generation that comes after them, from them, their offspring in other words, is only going to enjoy, shall we say in this example, 60% of the original potential of the parents. Still not bad, they're still doing pretty good. Now if they continue to be poorly nourished, then the generation that comes from them will be at an even lower potential. Now they're at plus 20. But again, they're not in the zone of disability. Now if we follow this along according to the Pottinger cat study, what we would see is with each of these generations, there were a set of signs and symptoms of degeneration. Now what happened when we got to the next generation, which now you have a generation of cats that were born but in the disability zone, that these were cats that were born sick, shall we say, born without the ability that their parents had and their grandparents had and their great-grandparents had, and in fact they had lost their ability to survive. And so that turned out to be the last generation, and that's why we see extinction, because one of the disabilities that appeared at that point was the inability to reproduce. This generation became sterile, and therefore they became the last generation. Well, perhaps we are looking at the same phenomenon in the human population, that when we started to see the introduction of processed foods about 100 years ago, and then just the expansion of all of that, now we're producing generation after generation that seems to have a lower health potential than their parents did. And now we're probably in a situation where many of our children that are being born today